What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. So one of my favorite movies of all time is Interstellar, and ever since I started learning Blender, I've wanted to recreate the iconic black hole Gargantua. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can make an incredibly realistic and cinematic black hole in Blender that, thanks to some optimization, actually renders pretty quickly too. And as you can see from some of these 4K renders, this setup has some serious detail, so you can have a great looking shot from just about any point of view. As you've probably noticed by now, this video is a bit longer than my usual content, so you may want to grab a snack first, but with that, let's jump in. So I've got a fresh project file here, and the first thing I'm going to do is switch over to Cycles, GPU Compute, and I'm going to lower my render samples to 128. Then I'm going to come down here to my color management, and I'm going to switch my look to medium-high contrast. And while you're here, you'll want to make sure that you're in the filmic view transformation. This is like a general rule for basically everything, but make sure that that is checked on. Then I'm going to come over here and delete the default light. And now, so for building the black hole, a black hole isn't really like an object. If you think about it, at least what we're seeing, what we see is the effect of light being bent so extremely that it can't escape. And so we need to simulate gravity affecting light. And the issue with that is that Blender considers light to be a perfectly straight line, because for 99.999% of all situations, it is effectively a straight line. So we need to make the straight light rays look like they're being bent. And the easiest way to do this is just a bunch of discrete iterations. For example, I've just added this curved circle here, and you can see it looks like a circle, like a nice curve, but of course it's just a set of discrete straight lines that bend ever so slightly between them to look like they're curved. So that's how we're going to get away with it. So the way we're going to bend the light is we're going to create a bunch of nested spheres, and each of those spheres is going to bend the light a little bit, and that'll create the effect of light actually being bent around the world origin. And so if we tab into edit mode with our default cube selected, right-click, subdivide, give this 9 cuts, then select everything and press Shift-Alt-S. This will let us use the 2-sphere transform to make this into a sphere. Tab out of edit mode, shade smooth, then add a subdivision surface modifier, and just set this to 1. Then you can go ahead and apply this. Tab into edit mode again, Shift-Alt-S, 2-sphere, make it a sphere again, and that's pretty good. Tab back out, and then we're going to rename this to shell. Then add in another cube, hide the shell, hop over into geometry nodes, and add a new geometry nodes modifier. Now I'll grab my shell from up here, and a transform geometry node, and just set this up like that. I'm also going to scale this down by 0.8. Then I'm going to grab a geometry to instance node. I'll plug this into a duplicate elements node and then make sure this is set to instance. And I'm going to slide all of this on over. Now I'm going to grab an integer node and plug this into the amount. And I'm going to set this to 64. This integer is going to control basically how many shells we have. And then in order to make this noticeable, because right now they're just all in the same space, perfectly overlapping each other. So we have to alter them a little bit. So grab a math node, set to divide, plug this in here, divide by 4.25, duplicate this again, plug the duplicate index and this value into here like that. Shift-D, set this to power, then plug this value into the base and set your exponent to 2.5. Now just grab an add node, and we're going to add one to this. So now if we grab a scale instances node, plug this in, and we zoom out, you can see we have a bunch of nested shells. And now the reason I used a power node here is because this lets us distribute the shells more compactly toward the center and further apart out here. Because if you think about it, the lensing of the gravity is going to be much, much more intense down here toward the center compared to out here. And so we want to have more shells so that we have a more realistic solution there. So that's why we have that. Then you're going to want to grab a realize instances node, click that into there. And actually, while I'm at this, you're going to want to make sure to save your file, just in case things can get a little bit heavier during the process later, and I don't want you to lose your progress. Now we're just going to plug in a set shade smooth node and a set material node, plugged in like that, and I'll assign myself a material over here. Now with that done, we can hop over into our shader editor, jump over to rendered view, and I'm actually going to hide our set of spheres. I'll also rename this to lens. So now in order to see the lens actually working, we need something for it to lens. So I'm going to add in sort of a stand-in accretion disk by adding in a circle, scaling this up a bit, pressing ES to scale this out even further. And there we go. Give this a new material, set this to an emission shader. Then I'm going to grab a checker texture, set this to be a little bit darker. There we go. And I'm going to grab a texture coordinate node. So you don't really need to do this right now, but it'll speed things up later. I'm just going to plug in the object coordinates, set this scale to something much, much, much lower. And I'm just going to bring in two node groups that we're going to need later, just so that you guys can see them. You don't really need to know how they work, so I'm just going to show you them and you can copy them directly. So I've just appended these two nodes here. And so I'm just going to link these for free in the description. But this spherical coordinates node, what it does is it takes like the object coordinates, which are in Cartesian, so you have your X, Y, and Z, and it converts them to spherical coordinates, which is your radius, your distance from the origin, your theta, which you can think of as like your angle above or below the horizon, and then there's this phi, which is like your rotation around the z-axis. And so then this Cartesian coordinates node just converts them back. Again, I'm going to link these in the description. There's not really anything here you have to understand. It's just converting a couple mathematical equations into like Blender nodes. So you can see if we plug these in directly, one for one, then into here we don't have any difference. But one little neat thing is that if we just grab a combine XYZ node and plug our radius, theta, and phi into the X, Y, and Z respectively, and plug this in, and then we grab a math node and multiply our phi value, you can see we get this like sort of radial texture, which can be pretty useful for visualizing our black hole for now. So yeah, just download these in the description, and we're going to be using these later in our accretion disk too. So now we can click our lens back on, click onto here, and click to our material that we have assigned, delete the principled BSDF, and we're going to grab a refraction shader. And now this IOR value, this controls how much the light's going to bend when it hits the sphere. So if I set this to 1, we get no bending, but you'll notice we actually get this weird artifact of these dark lines. And the reason we're getting that is because Blender, by default, is only set to calculate 12 transmission passes. And over here in our geometry nodes, we created 64 of these shells. And so we need to be able to calculate exactly double that amount. And so if we set transmission and total to 128, you can see that resolves the problem. Now, as we increase this IOR, it'll bend the light more. But the thing is, we don't want the light to bend just evenly across every sphere. We want it to bend more intensely toward the center. So I'm going to grab a coordinates node and a vector math node. Set this vector math to length, then plug the object coordinates into here. Then if we plug this into the IOR slot, grab a math node, set this to add 1, and you can see we're getting nothing, and that's because we have to do a lot more math to this real quick. So grab another math node, set this to subtract, and subtract 1.4. I'm going to be using a couple values that are going to seem kind of arbitrary here, by the way. These are not just random values I've selected. I've just done a lot of fine-tuning to this over the last couple weeks. So if at any point you think to yourself that altering one of these values makes it look better, by all means do that. Again, this is a lot of my personal preference going into here, but it is also a lot of refinement. So it's not just completely random selection. Now with that, we're going to set our power to minus 0.5. Come over here, set this to divide, and we're going to divide by our sort of like resolution amount, if you want to think about it, whatever we put into this integer slot. And so now we've got this effect. And you can see it's like kind of working, but not really. The first thing we want to fix is this weird effect that's happening at the edges of all the spheres. So let's grab ourselves a layer weight node and a color ramp. Plug the facing value into here. Set this blend to like 0.9. And if you can see what this looks like, it just looks like this. And we're just going to make the light intensity very small toward the edge. Plug this back in. So if we duplicate this, set it to multiply, and plug in our color ramp, then we can set this white value to something pretty high, pretty close. And you can see this has gotten rid of that weird edge effect. Now I'm going to hop over here, and after my add node, I'm going to set a power node to 2, because in real life, of course, it is a squared fall off. As you get further away, grab another math node, set this to multiply, and I'm going to set this to 2.8. Now if you duplicate your power node, and we're going to have to set this to something smaller, I'm going to set this to 1.74. I found a value of like 1.7 to 1.8 to be pretty good. Then we're just going to multiply this again by a whole lot. I'm going to go like 22, maybe a little bit more, and that looks pretty darn good to me. But now one thing you're going to notice is that the center of our black hole isn't actually really black. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to add a regular old UV sphere, shade it smooth, shrink it down to something like 0.1, and we're just going to add an emission shader to it with a strength of 0, and that'll prevent those like erroneous sort of light bounces. And I do want to reiterate, by the way, this is like extremely realistic. This is basically how it's done by like the people who made Interstellar. Obviously, they were using a special rendering engine, not just shells of glass. But yeah, this is an extremely realistic result. And I also want to add, before I go any further, like credit where it's due, this lensing setup, I by no means am the person who came up with this, I do want to say. The person I learned about this from was Samuel Krug. You've maybe heard of his channel, but I know he also heard about it from somewhere else. This has been around on the internet for a while now. Just want to make sure, credit where credit is due. Now, one more thing I do want to add is I want to make a sharp sort of halo ring around my black hole. And to do that, again, we're going to grab our friend, the texture coordinate node, and a vector math node. Plug this into here, get the length again. Then grab a map range node. Plug this value into here. Then set your min value to 2 and leave your max at 1. And we're going to plug this into the color slot on our refraction. And we're just going to kind of artificially amplify the light right here near the edge. And so in order to isolate that edge, we're going to set this to 2.37 for our min. And our from max is going to be 4. And just like that, you can see we have like this just beautiful halo effect. Yeah, it really is just amazing what Blender can do. I mean, this is just honestly amazing as is, but now we're going to add in the accretion disk, and this thing is going to be beautiful. And so now, before we actually do that, I'm going to scale this down a bit, just to make the scale a bit more workable. Then I'm going to click on my camera, and I'm going to set my focal length to 300 millimeters. And the reason I'm making this so telescopic is that if you think about it, even in space, when something is like close by to you, it's still thousands and thousands of kilometers away. And so at that length, even something that's nearby, you need basically a telescope in order to zoom in on it. And so by making our focal length more telescopic, we're going to get a much more realistic result. So now I'm just going to line up my view. And if you select render region over here, then that'll make this render a little bit quicker. You'll also want to adjust this clip start and clip end on your camera, just like that. Maybe rotate the disk. And yeah, that looks pretty good to me for now. Maybe zoom in a little bit more. There we go. Now I'm going to hide my stand-in accretion disk. And I'm going to make my world absolute black. Hopping back into our layout, I'm going to add in a cube, tab into edit mode, scale, then Shift Z to only scale on the X and Y, and scale this by like 60, and that should be good. This looks like laughably huge, but don't worry, all the effects are going to come from the volumetrics, so as long as this is just really big, you'll have no issues. Now I'm going to rename this to accretion disk, and give it a new material. Then I'm going to give this a copy rotation constraint, and just select our accretion disk stand-in. Now for the shader, delete the principal BSDF, and add an emission into the volume. So starting out, we're going to make a mask for how intense the emission should be based on its distance from the center. So we're going to create sort of like a donut. And so at this point, you might know how we're going to do this. We're going to grab a texture coordinate node and a vector math node, set this to length, object into the vector, slide this over again, grab a float curve node, and a map range node. So this length obviously goes all the way to effectively like infinity, or the largest number Blender can calculate. But our float curve works on values of 0 to 1. So we have to define like the farthest point and the closest point to the center. So for my closest point, I'm going to do something like that. And then I want this to reach to a value of about 10 away. And if I plug this into the value and plug this into the strength, and then alter my float curve, you can see we've got the start of like our disk. And so yeah, if you notice this weird kind of like volumes being projected on the surface effect, just restart your file really quick. That always fixes the issue for me. Not sure why that happens, but yeah. So I'm going to adjust my fall off to be something kind of like this, maybe? Because I want more like an intense ring and then a very nice sort of fall off there. And so something like that looks pretty good to me. And then you can always add in a power node and increase this to make the fall off like even sharper. And again, if you adjust this from max value, that's going to adjust effectively the radius of your emission. Might even increase this just a tiny bit. But now that we have our donut mask, we have to create a height mask. And so this is going to basically affect like the thickness of our accretion disk. So by grabbing a separate XYZ and then a math node, plug the Z into there, set this to multiply. And I'm just going to set this to 1 for now, and you'll see why we added this in just a sec. So duplicate this again, set this to absolute value. So this way we just have the distance from the XY axis. Then we're going to grab a map range node again, and we're going to grab another float curve, plug this value into here. Then I'm going to set my minimum value to something like -1 and leave my max at 1 for right now. plug this into the value slot. Again, we're going to have this mapped like this. And now if we multiply these two masks together, and I may need to set these to something lower. Let's do minus 0.1 and 0.1. You can see, there we go. Now we have control over the thickness of our accretion disk. And so I'm going to create a value node just for ease of access later. And I'm going to group this into a node group. And I'm going to rename this to thickness. Drag this on up here. Grab a math node. Plug this into a multiply by -1. Plug this into here, and then just plug the value directly into the from max. Come in here and adjust this. And this way we can adjust the thickness of all of our layers just from one single node group. Because we're going to create two. We're going to create an emission and an absorption, like accretion disk, basically. And so I'm also adjust my endpoints here to make this a bit smoother. And now I'm actually going to set my thickness over here. I'm going to set this to something much larger. Then I'm going to come back here to this multiply node, and I'm going to increase this. And so you can see this has the same effect as altering our thickness. But the reason we've added this in here is I'm going to grab a Musgrave texture, and I'm going to use this to actually control the thickness to an extent. So if I grab a map range node again, and set my minimum value to 0.2, set my maximum to 4, then make my minimum like 5, max 100, and plug this on in. Then if I set this to multifractal, and adjust these values here, and so I'll actually grab my texture coordinate node, and there you go. Now you can really see the actual effect. But now we're going to have to bring in our spherical coordinates and our Cartesian coordinates nodes. Just plug these in one for one. Slide this on over. Slide this over again. Grab a vector math node. And I'm going to make one alteration to this before I do anything more. And that is set this to multiply. Set all these values to 1, except the z, I'm going to make this 2. This sort of just flattens it, which makes sense. If you think about it, it's a spinning disk, and so things are going to flatten out. Now, if you hit Control right-click, you can cut that, and it'll go back. There we go. And now I'm going to start doing some math in between these two nodes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a math node, plug this into the theta, and set this to power. Now, if we set this to something like a minus 1.2, and then I plug this into my surface again, you can see as we adjust this value, it starts to sort of stretch radially to give that like moving around sort of feel. And so that's exactly what we want. And again, I'm going to use a value node, group this, and I'm going to name this to twist. Then plug this into my exponent value. Set this to minus 1.2. Looks pretty good. And yeah, and so this is one place that you could stop, but in real life, you get more of a spiraling effect too. It's not just this circling around. So if we duplicate our math node and we set this to add, we can then duplicate our texture coordinate setup. And once again, we're going to set this to length. And I'm going to group this. Drag this over. Set a math node to power. Exponent of 0.5. Grab a map range node. Plug this into here. This into the output. Then I'll plug my output into this add slot. And now I'll have it affect anywhere from 0 to 5 values. Go a little further if you want. And as you can see, if I increase this, I get like this nice sort of spiraling effect. And so I'm going to lower this a little bit. Something like that looks pretty good. Then I'm going to duplicate this math node, set it to add, and grab a group input node. And you can see if I adjust this value now, it just alters its rotation about the z-axis. And we're just going to use this to randomize all of our noise textures we create in a second. And so cut this again, zoom on in, and now you can see where our volumetrics are starting to come about. And one more thing we actually have to do, we have to adjust in our render settings, is if you come down to volumes, we're going to need to adjust this step rate. And so I'm going to set this to 0.1. And that's going to tell Blender to pay way more attention to our volumes, basically give them more fidelity and more detail. Then I'm going to lower my max steps to like 64, so that way it will keep our renders at a reasonable speed. And so with that done, maybe alter this a little bit more. And so with this done, I'm going to class this as my emission mask. But first I'm going to duplicate this noise setup. Then I'm going to highlight all this, Control J to join. And I'm just going to Control Shift D on these noise textures. So that way we keep them connected. Then I'm going to grab a math node, set this to multiply, and we're going to use these noise textures to add even more detail. And plug this in. There we go. And you can see that already adds like a whole bunch of detail, but we need to alter this a lot to make it look a lot better. So first thing, I'm going to adjust the add values on these node groups to randomize them. Then I'm going to take this bottom noise texture, and I'm going to make this like the larger scale noise. And so set this to something like that. There we go. Lower this dimension even more. And I'm going to make this top noise a very high detail texture. And so set the scale pretty high and lower my dimension again, not quite to 0, but just about. And now one more thing you can do is if you use a power node and increase your value here, that acts like increasing contrast for these noise textures. And so this can be useful. Then I'm going to add just a little bit to both of these. So this way we don't have any areas where there's no emission. At least not really, aside from, of course, our mask. And yeah, there we go. Now I'll just multiply this by something like laughably huge. Maybe do something more like 25. Because, and remember, we're going to add in some absorption now, so we're going to actually reduce the amount of light you see. So I've just made it extremely bright for now. But we're going to Shift D to slide this on up. And this is going to become our absorption mask. And so if we grab a volume absorption node, there we go. Plug this into the density and grab ourselves an add shader node. Adjust this color. I'm going to do something like a dark brown. And then first thing I'm going to do is just adjust my add values here to make this like way more random. Then I'm going to adjust my fall off. And so the first thing I'm going to do is make it so this extends further away. But then I'm also going to adjust the fall off here. And the nice part about this is that since we're using absorption, this is going to render a lot faster than if we were using scattering, like literally twice as fast. Also adjust my z-axis mask. Adjust my noise texture for this. And then I think I'm going to alter the thickness value for this compared to the emission. And so I'm going to set this to something less than the value I used for my emission. And yeah, that's looking pretty gorgeous to me. I'll adjust the light of my emission, something kind of golden red. And then one more thing I'm going to do is, just like how we compressed our noise texture for the vertical mask, I'm going to compress the noise textures that we're using here even more. So I'm going to set this to a 6 for both of these. I'm also going to rename my node group we used to cause the spiral to spiraling. There we go. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it, actually. Everything else we're going to do now is just in the compositor. And so, of course, like, do go through here and alter these. I've just made tons of tiny, tiny little adjustments over the course of several days, and it has improved dramatically. So as you go through, consider working with your noise textures. You can adjust your scale and whatnot to give a different effect than I may have created. You can adjust things like the fall off. You can add in more noise textures if you like. Instead of just doing a small and large, maybe you want to add in a medium as well. You can adjust the step rate. But yeah, that is it pretty much for the actual 3D side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to render out a quick pass in HD, and then I'm going to show you a few compositing tips that really are going to elevate this. Okay, so with that rendered out, I'm going to hop over to my compositor, check Use Nodes, slide this over, Shift right click to create a junction, and that'll give us a viewer node. Also, by the way, if you want to speed up your renders, one thing I recommend is upping this noise threshold. I usually set it to around a 0.1, but if you're doing like an animation or something, you need a lot of frames, you can even get away with like a 0.5, and that will help you a lot. You can also set your max samples to as low as 64, and you'll still get pretty good results, but also make sure you're using the denoising effect check here, rather than just the denoising node, as I've noticed this tends to have better results. So we're going to have a pretty simple compositing setup. I'm going to set in a glare node, set this to streaks, and I'm going to set this to high. Then I'm going to set my color modulation to like a 0, and set my mix pretty low as well. Lower my threshold though to something like that, and I'm going to lower my fade a tiny bit. Also, if you come down here over options and check OpenCL, that lets you use your GPU if you have it to speed up some of the compositing nodes. Now I like that, just giving us a little bit of that halo glow there. And if you press Alt-V, you can zoom in, and if you press V, you can zoom out. A little bit unintuitive, but you get used to it. Now I'm going to grab myself a blur node. So if I slide this on up, and I'm going to create another junction, I'm going to plug this into the blur node here. Make sure this is set to Gaussian. Then I'm going to grab a mix node. I'll set this to add, and then I'm going to blur my image by something like around 50, and plug this into the bottom slot. Slide down my factor a little bit, and you can see this gives us a really nice like bloom or glowing effect. Probably reduce this even more, something around a 0.1, because you don't want to over composite, otherwise it gives it that really edited looking sort of feel, but you do want to make sure that your image looks as good as it can. So I'm going to duplicate this again, and now for this Gaussian, I'm going to create a very blurred image, so like something like 750 pixels of blur. Plug this into here, and then grab a hue saturation value node. You can see this gives us like a volumetric glowing bloom effect, which I think is like super pretty. But to make this look even cooler, I'm going to add in a hue saturation value. Lower this to make this more of a blue rather than the reddish orange we have. And I mean, that looks like pretty darn beautiful if you're asking me. You can pull up your compositor viewer and yeah, this is pretty incredible. Again, I highly recommend you go through and tweak the little values like your color values, your noise values a little bit, just to get something that you're really, really happy with. And then you can also adjust, maybe say like your exposure if you wanted to, something like that. Play with your gamma a touch. Either way, yeah, this is a really nice looking final result, I think. And yeah, that's the tutorial, guys. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video, then consider doing all the YouTube jazz, liking, subscribing, all that stuff. If you want to get the project file for all the shots at the start of the video, then that'll be on my Gumroad, link in the description below. Also a cool way to support the channel if you want to. But yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something, and I hope to see y'all next time.